Welcome, everyone. My name is Esther Lee, the president of Chinese American Heritage Foundation. We are honored to have David Lei, our senior advisor and a dear friend, to talk about May 4th, 1919 movement. Today is the 103rd anniversary of this new cultural movement. David Lei is an accomplished entrepreneur with a deep-seated commitment to community development. After graduating with a degree in business administration from UC Berkeley, he started his own consumer goods exporting company in 1981, but not before spending time in the social sector, working with at-risk Asian and African American youth through Chinatown's YMCA and Richmond's Model City program. He sold his business in 2003 and retired. David was the board vice chair of the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco and very passionate about Chinese art and culture. However, he found the field was too broad and deep. In recent years, he switched to Chinese American history, which is more manageable with only 170 years. He has given talk at Chinese Genealogy Conference, the Commonwealth Club, 1882 Foundation in DC, CACA Convention in Boston, the California Historical Society, the Chinese Historical Society of America, and actually he was also a commencement speaker to the 2019 graduating class at UC Berkeley. So now, just a reminder, if you have any question during or after the presentation, please type them in the Q&A box rather than the chat box. It'll be easier for me to find the question in one spot. So without further ado, let me welcome David Lei.
Thank you so much, Esther. Can you hear? Okay, let me share screen first. And I'm going to put my picture on instead of the video because I'm in the Oakland Hills and I get very poor internet reception. I want to use less of it. So I'm going to stop the video, but I'll share screen. Is this okay? I assume everybody can see this. Esther, can you see this?
Yes.
Okay. The May 4th movement in 1919 pushed China to modernization. It was initiated by students and intellectuals. This movement promoted the use of the vernacular or the everyday spoken Chinese in literature and education. So it switched from the classics to a spoken language, which we use today. Because of the promotion of the vernacular, the Cantonese written language evolved during this period of reform. The movement was anti-colonialism and imperialism, especially against Japan. It looked to science and democracy to solve the ills of China. It brought about nationalism and patriotism for the Chinese in both China and the overseas Chinese. It was very much supported by the Chinese Americans because how China was perceived is how Americans perceive the Chinese Americans, and it is still true today. Now, I am not an expert on the May 4th movement and chose this topic as a joke. I was assigned to give a talk for this May 4th date, and jokingly, I said, I'll talk about the May 4th movement. When no one in the room knew what the May 4th movement was, I took this as a challenge to talk about this. So don't believe all that I say. I'm here to inspire you to do your own research. And I'm trying to go down and it doesn't seem to want to go down. Just a second. Can you see this now?
Yes.
Okay. in the afternoon of May 4th, 1919, 3,000 students from 13 universities in Peking came out to Tiananmen to protest the Versailles Treaty, which was the treaty to end World War I. And they wanted to protest the international bullying of China, especially by Japan. So on the upper left is the same day on May 4th, 1919. Notice the 5-color flag on the upper left corner. That was the flag of China, representing the 5 major ethnicities of China. A flag like that was at the Hanford Temple, Hanford, California, up until the fire. I hope it's still safe because that's the only place where I've seen this flag, one of the original flag. Today, this movement is mainly forgotten, except for this memorial in Beijing. And nowadays, this May 4th is celebrated in China as Youth Day. They don't talk about the reform and the anti-colonialism. They just call it Youth Day. And in Taiwan, they call it Literary Day because of the changes from the classics to the vernacular, the spoken language and literature. So how did all these get started? Some people think it started with the Taiping Rebellion. And this was in 1850 to 1864. It was basically civil war. It was the Hakka, this person called HiuQuan. He was a Hakka or Kejia. He believed he was the brother of Jesus, and his mission was to overthrow the Manchu. And as many people died in this rebellion as all the deaths in World War II, so it was very, very bloody. At the same time, we had the gold rush in California, and some people say this was the push to have the Chinese come to America because of all the Civil War disruption, famine. They had to leave and come to California for better opportunities. I think it was more for opportunity than this rebellion because Guangdong province, where most of the gold miners came from, were not so much affected. This was in Guangxi, more in Guangxi and in Nanjing. And that's a whole other topic I can talk about another day of why the Chinese came and who came. And some people say this movement was started because of the Opium Wars. There were 2, one from 1839 to 1842, and the second one from 1856 and ended in 1860. China was carved up by the imperialist Western powers during this period. And it was very obvious China was helpless against Western modern technologies. The Chinese began to question Confucianism, the classics, and the monarchy. Can these old traditions save China? Or must China change all these and modernize by learning from the West? At the end of the Opium War in 1860, General Charles Gordon arrived in China. He had missed the main fighting and did cleanup operation. And this was the end of the Taiping Rebellion. I take that back, end of the Opium War. So, but when Gordon came, he was appalled by the atrocities committed by the Taipings. As reprisal for the killing of a few British and French soldiers under a white flag, the Western forces looted and burned the summer palace, as you can see in the upper left. Gordon took part in this, but later regretted the burning in a letter to his sister. The Chinese never forgot his role in the burning of the summer palace. And Chinese Gordon, or General Gordon, was killed in Khartoum in the Sudan in 1885, protecting the empire, the British Empire. Zhou Enlai, 80 years later, visited Khartoum in 1964 and thanked the Sudanese for killing Chinese Gordon 80 years later. The Chinese have these long memories. The shame of a weak China still resonate with most of the Chinese in China. And in 1885, when General Gordon was killed, many of us can recall the famous Chinatown map of 1885, where in America, the Americans were very much against the Chinese and wanted to point out the vices in Chinatown, the gambling establishments, the prostitution, and the josh houses or the Chinese temples. This was all very much against American values, and this was at the same time. Then came the Sino-Japanese War in 1894 and 95. It was fought over the control of Korea. China was defeated badly by the modern Japanese army. Japan started modernizing under the Meiji Restoration in 1868 and modernized very quickly. In 1868, 1868 is the same year as the Burlingame Treaty, which gave Chinese the right to immigrate to America and gave some government protection to Chinese Americans. With modernization, especially militarily, Japan had its eyes on Korea, which at the time was under the control of China. Yuan ShiKai, on the bottom right, was initially sent to China to manage the situation in Korea in 1882, the year of the Chinese exclusion. The world was shocked that in 36 years of modernization, Japan easily defeated China. Yuan ShiKai was very lucky that he was recalled back to China right before the fighting started in Korea. And he came out of the war with his reputation intact. Due to the poor showing of the Chinese military in this defeat, Yuan was assigned to build a modern army for China. Evidently, he was a very good administrator and ended up with the most modern army in all of China. With the army behind him, he forced Sun Yat-sen in 1912 to step down as president of the provincial government after only 45 days for Sun Yat-sen of being president. And Yuan ShiKai became the second president and dismantled the provincial government. However, during his time, he reformed the banking system, China's banking. He reformed education, started universities and schools, built China's first railroad, and fought against corruption. He might have been a hero in China's history, if not for his imperial ambitions. He declared himself emperor in 1915, but before he formally ascended the throne, he died in 1916. So during this time of the Sino-Japanese War in 1894, the Chinese in America had other problems in mind. In 1892, the Geary Act renewed the 1882 Exclusion Act, but added the requirement for all Chinese in America to carry at all times a photo ID proving that they were legal aliens. In response, the Chinese refused. They said only dogs need to carry an identification tag, and only criminals needs to be registered with the government. And we Chinese are neither dogs nor criminals, so we refuse to do this. So about 100,000 Chinese in America, or 95% or 97% of the Chinese in America at that time, refused to register. This is the largest instance of civil disobedience ever in America. The Chinese sued the US government over this requirement to register, but eventually lost the Fong Yue Ting versus the US Supreme Court case 2 years later. So in 1894, they all had to go and register. You will notice the arrow pointing to this registration, that it was done in 1894 and not 1892. And almost all the ones, almost all the certificate of residence that I've seen are 1894. So if you find one 1892, it's pretty rare. Now comes the 1898 reforms, the 100 Days reform. By this reform was executed by Emperor Guangxu, but it was put down in 100-day by the Empress Dowager Cixi, Empress Dowager Cixi, who had a coup and arrested the emperor. And at this same time, 1898, we have the U.S. versus Wong Kim Ark. And this case gave all Americans the right to birthright citizenship. And it was this case, and the Chinese brought up many of these cases and sued the federal government over and over again. Now, the leaders of this 100-day reform were Kang YouWei on the left. He's from Nanhai, Guangdong province, which is part of the Samyup district. And the other was Liang QiChao on the right. He's from Sanwei, Guangdong province also. We don't hear much about the other people that participated in this 100-day reform, such as SiTong and several others, because they were soon executed after this failed 100-day reform. In all, the emperor in this 100 days issued more than 40 edicts, which if enacted would have transformed every conceivable aspect of Chinese society. The old civil service examination system based on the Chinese classic was ordered abolished, and a new system of national schools and colleges was established. Western industry, medicine, science, commerce, and patent systems were promoted and adopted. Government administration was revamped, the law codes were changed, the military was reformed, and corruption was attacked. However, China might have thrown out the baby with the water. Reformers were fervent about destroying temples, superstitions, rituals. Isn't that what the Taliban did in recent years? So I thought it went a little overboard. Per my mentors, Cui Mei-ho and Bennett Brownson in Seattle, they have a new book out, just came out last month, called Chinese Traditional Temples in North America, 1849 to 1920s, to the 1920s. In California alone, there were about 200 Chinese temples. All were Taoist, just about, and they almost all disappeared between 1890 and 1920s during this reform and modernizing period of China. And so all these traditions and values, many of these went along with the reforms. Liang QiChao on the right had a famous son, Liang SiCgeng, who married Lin HuiYin, an educated and modern woman, and in my opinion, was quite beautiful. Both Liang QiChao's son and his wife were educated at the University of Pennsylvania in 1924 and returned to China in 1928 as part of this being educated in the West and being patriotic to return to China and to modernize China. And they brought and taught modern architecture to China. They discovered the oldest wooden structures in China going back to the Tang Dynasty. And they suggested that the abandoned Beijing city wall be turned into what we have today in New York, the High Line, to be a tourist attraction, to have parks where people can walk on top of the temple. But their plans were turned down. Sadly, the Beijing city walls were torn down and removed in 1953 to allow for better traffic flow. There's a great book written about Liang QiChao's son and his wife called Liang and Lin by Martha Fairbank. It was really a love story of this couple. And by the way, Maya Lin, who designed the Vietnam Memorial, is the niece of Lin HuiYin, the wife of Liang QiChao's son. Kang YouWei on the left was a scholar and a reformer. He pushed for a constitutional monarchy to keep the emperor, but to report to a constitution. And this was fashioned after Meiji Japan. And he pushed for this even after China became a republic in 1911. After the failure of the 100-day reform, he fled to Japan and eventually to the US, Canada, and Mexico. And while here in Canada and the US, he formed a Baohuang Hui, the Protect the Emperor Association, which became the China Empire Reform Association. Probably more Chinese Americans supported Kang's China Empire Reform Association than Sun Yat-sen in the early 20th century. This association, this China Empire Reform Association, was an important San Francisco organization as it had one of the 15 board seats at the Chinese hospital, which was formed in the early 1920s. Interestingly, although this organization, the China Empire Reform Association, is long defunct, by the 1930s, it was already defunct. Two people today still claim membership to this organization so that they can be on the board of the Chinese hospital. Another interesting story is Kang's collaboration with an American named Homer Lia. Lia was asked by Kang to train Chinese Americans to form an army to go back to China to remove the Empress Dowager and restore Guangxu Emperor to the throne. There are pictures of such Chinese Americans in surplus military uniform in the early 1900s. This plan was all show and was abandoned. However, Homer Lia did write several books, one of which was a bestseller called The Valor of Ignorance. In this book, he predicted the eventual war between the US and Japan, and that the Japanese would easily overrun the Philippines, which was a US territory, and will launch a surprise attack on the US. And Liang even predicted that the attack will be at Pearl Harbor. This book was a bestseller, and 84,000 copies was sold the first month in 1909. And Liang donated the proceeds of the sales of this book to Sun Yat-sen. Then by 1900, we have the Boxer Rebellion. It was a peasant uprising against Westerners and Chinese Christians, ruthlessly killing the Christians and Westerners in northern China. The Chinese imperial court and the Empress Dowager sided with the Boxers to rid China of Westerners and colonialism. However, the Western countries sent 45,000 troops from 8 nations to end this Boxer Rebellion and save the Westerners trapped in Beijing. One side note is that the U.S. 9th Infantry went to China to save the Westerners, and they were later stationed in Tacoma, Washington. After the Boxers were put down, there were extensive looting by the Allied armies. For decades after the Boxer Rebellion, savvy antique dealers would frequent the flea markets and auction houses near the Tacoma area and find such loots. At the same time, 1900, San Francisco Chinatown was dealing with a plague. The Chinese were blamed for this plague, and Chinatown was quarantined with barbed wires, and the borders of Chinatown were patrolled, as you can see in this picture. Now, at the end of this month, May 24th, if you look at your local PBS station, there is a documentary called Plague at the Golden Gate, and the trailer is per this link. And if you can take a picture of this screen, you can go and look for, or just look for Plague at the Golden Gate. It documents that our current situation is a replay of what happened in San Francisco in 1900. Also, by the early 1900s, actually by the 1870s, in San Francisco, the Tongs were very active. Here we see the Qigong Tong. They were an anti-Manchu or anti-Qing dynasty secret society. Members were sworn to overthrow the Manchu Qing government. Later, these were known as the Tongs, the secret societies, and they were started in China, actually, in the 1700s as the Tendi Hui, the Hongmen, the Hongsun Tang, and much later in the US as the Qigong Tong, and later as the Chinese Freemason. The secret societies came to the US with the gold rush. Unlike clan associations and district association, anyone can join. Any last name, people from different districts can join these tongs. They were first mentioned in the Daily Alta California newspaper in 1854 as the Hong Society, and this Hong Society later became the Qigong Tong in the 1870s. And then much later became the Chinese Freemason to give them more respectability in America. The Qigong Tong financially supported reformers and revolutionaries in China, including Sun Yat-sen. In fact, the Qigong Tong was one of his main supporters, and eventually they overthrew the Qing dynasty, the Qing government, in 1911. The Qigong Tong became the most influential influential Chinese American institution by the 1890s, with 373 branches in the Americas and 70 in Mexico alone. Even today, under the communists, it is recognized as a legitimate political party in China. Dr. Tang, in the picture below, he's second from the left, was the president of the Qigong Tong in China when he visited San Francisco 3 years ago. Till this day, the Qigong Tong's stated mission is to make China a democratic republic with free election. The Qigong Tong backed Sun Yat-sen with his ideal of making China a republic with free election, which was achieved in 1911. And it was the third republic ever in the world. The first was the US, the second was France, and China was the third. And the US was the first to recognize China as a republic because there weren't that many. Now, on May 11th, on this same platform, I will be giving another talk, Everything You Want to Know About the Tongs, but were afraid to ask. So do join me again on May 11th if you have interest in finding out more about the Tongs. On the other side of the monarchy, on the other side were the monarchists. They were against a republic, a democratic free election for China. They believe that China always had a monarch, an emperor, and should retain an emperor, but it should be a constitutional monarchy. And so they formed, Kang YouWei formed this China Empire Reform Association. It started in Canada in the early 1900s. This association was very progressive, especially in women's rights. Here's a poster of the Ladies Reform Association, headed by Kang's daughter, Kang TongBi. And that's her and her small pictures right under the emperor on the top of the poster. She's the small picture underneath the emperor. But there's a bigger picture of her. She was only 16 years of age, but she traveled all over Canada and US and gave speeches in English and Chinese for women's suffrage and women's rights. And she ended up going to Barnard in New York, I guess the female side of Columbia University. At about the same time, there was this whole movement, the whole new culture movement in China, headed by these people, and of course there were more. This was the new cultural movement started mainly by intellectuals who were mainly educated overseas. They promoted a new Chinese culture based upon progressive, modern, and Western ideals like democracy and science. They argued that the modern vernacular Chinese, or Baihua, should replace literary Chinese as the language of education, or classical Chinese as the language of education. Chen DuXiu, on the left, studied in Japan, was founder of the influential and widely circulated New Youth magazine that was written in the vernacular, although he was trained as a classical scholar. But he chose to write this magazine in the vernacular, which promoted new culture and reforms. Chen later became the dean of Peking University, and later he was one of the founders of the Chinese Communist Party. Hu Si, on the right, studied at Cornell and Columbia. He returned to China to teach at Peking University right before the May 4th movement. He also wrote for the New Youth magazine and pushed for writing in the vernacular, and he himself wrote in the vernacular. who later became a diplomat and was the Chinese ambassador to US and was also nominated for the Nobel Prize for Literature. So on the upper right, we have pictures of the New Youth magazine and newspaper. And at this time, there were dozens and dozens of these new newspapers and magazines that were put out by these intellectuals for pushing for reform in China. And of course, in San Francisco, the Chinese were very aware of what was going on in China by reading the postings on the walls. Then by 1915 came Japan's 21 demand. 21 demands. The 21 demands was a set of demands made during the First World War by the Empire of Japan to the government of the Republic of China on January 18th, 1915. It was a secret demand sent only to the government, but was later leaked. And these demands greatly extended Japanese control of China, especially northern China. Yuan ShiKai was the head of the republic at that time and meekly accepted these demands in May 1915. This bullying by the Japanese outraged the Chinese, which started to boycott Japanese products in China and amongst the Chinese in America. At the same time, both the Chinese and the Japanese in San Francisco had their own pavilion at the Pan-Pacific International Expo, or the PPIE. And this was in 1915 held at the Marina District in San Francisco. The PPIE introduced many world cultures at this World's Fair, especially native cultures, such as the Hawaiian culture. The first time Hawaiian dances were introduced, Polynesian dances were introduced to America. However, the hidden message of the PPIE was the superiority of the white race as compared with all these other native cultures. Eugenics and social Darwinism was the science of the day. Now, during the COVID pandemic, I often hear people say to follow the science. But from 1880s till the 1840s, eugenics and social Darwinism was a science. So racism was a science. If you listen to the scientists in those days, because the head of the eugenics had some very prominent scientists, including Alexander Graham Bell, who was one of the co-chairs, and Luther Burbank, and the list goes on and on. So at Peking University, Cai YuanPei was the president of the Peking University starting in 1917. And he was one of the reformers. He proposed that education must be independent of the government. He established academic freedom and a pure research atmosphere. Cai not only improved women's equity in education and in the education system, but admitted the first women into Peking University in 1920. Cai protected the students during the May 4th movement in 1919 and quit as president of the university in protest when students were arrested for the May 4th movement. In 1919, China was on the side of the Allies for World War I, sending around 250,000 laborers to help the Allies in Europe for the war effort. Some were students and intellectuals who were sent as laborers. This was the first time large number of Chinese intellectuals and students worked side by side with laborers. Many took this experience back with them to China and formed alliances with these same workers. During the war, the Allies took over the German possession in Shandong province, and China expected these territories to be returned back to China after the war. Instead, at Versailles, Japan, with secret agreements with the Allies, was to get the former German territories and not China. Once again, the Chinese students were outraged, and this triggered the May 4th movement. Organized by the university in Peking and soon with other universities all over China, they protested at TianAnMen. It was the first time the students formed national organizations, student organizations in China. And here's another picture of the protest. They use white banners that's usually used for funerals, Chinese funerals, to symbolize the death of China. And they gather to burn Japanese goods. And this movement soon turned to be an anti-Japanese, anti-imperialist movement, and eventually turned to anti-Chinese government movement. And this is why China is still very afraid of any kind of movements, because it could easily turn to be anti-government. But this movement stirred nationalism and patriotism and promoted the vernacular language in literature and education. At this same time, 1919, we have the Spanish flu in America, and San Francisco, Chinatown was once again quarantined. But this was also the 50th anniversary of the Golden Spike, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, and the Chinese were not forgotten at the 50th anniversary. There were 8 Chinese chosen to be at the Golden Spike ceremony, and this 50th anniversary ceremony was held in Ogden, Utah. And the organizer looked for those 8 Chinese that participated in the original ceremony and found 3 of them. And they built the Chinese, these 3 Chinese afloat, and recognized that the Chinese built the western portion of the Transcontinental Railroad. One of the impacts and aftermath of the May 4th movement was the vernacular Chinese, that the vernacular Chinese came to the fore in literature and education. It was very much led by people like Lu Xun that wrote in the vernacular. The UN recognizes Cantonese as a separate language from Mandarin, is one of 6 world languages, and that Cantonese is not a dialect of Chinese. Cantonese is actually a much older language than Mandarin and is much more suited for reading the Tang Dynasty poems. It is much better than Mandarin because it'll rhyme and it has all the tones. This is because Cantonese is what the Cantonese call Tonghua, meaning the language of the Tang people, of the Tang dynasty. That's why we have Tong, the city of the Tang. That's what the Chinese in San Francisco call Chinatown, Tong. But by the early 20th century, many of the spoken Cantonese cannot be written. No Chinese character existed for many of the Chinese words. But with the vernacular language movement, the Cantonese started to make up written words for their own language, motivated by this reform and the use of the vernacular language. And it was really started because of Cantonese opera. To write the scripts, And here we have playbills for people to read the playbills in the Cantonese language. My friend Frank Yi reminded me today that with the awareness of the vernacular and female equality, the Chinese at this time added the female radical to words like ni and ta, which means you and them, denoting if they were female or not female. In San Francisco Chinatown, by the 1920s, two new theaters were built, modern theater. We have the Mandarin Theaters on Grand Avenue, and built in 1924, operated by the Chinese Empire Reform Association. So they gave plays to tell the audience that China should be a monarchist, should be a monarchy, a constitutional monarchy. Whereas at that time called the Great China Theater, today called the Great Star Theater, was built in 1925, and that was built by the Kuomintang, the KMT, to tell their stories. Now, on May 9th, my friend John Lowe and I will give a talk on this same platform called Chinese Opera Like Medicine, Bitter to Take with Sweet Outcomes. So join us on May 19th if you have interest to know more about Cantonese opera. The May 4th movement influenced a new generation of writers. Here shown is Li Mangui. She was most likely the first Chinese American playwright, born in 1906 in Taishan, Guangdong, and from a village school. She ended up at Peking University before going to graduate school at Michigan U and Columbia. At Michigan, she wrote an English play called The Grand Garden, and she entered it in competition with Arthur Miller for the prestigious Hopwood Award. Lee won $500, whereas Miller only won $250 for Miller's first play called No Villain. Li Mangui returned to China in 1940 to join the nationalist government in Chongqing against Japanese aggression. After World War II, when the nationalist government was still in power and had free elections, Li, in 1947, was elected senator, or Lifa Weiyuan, for Guangdong province to the legislative yuan. After the communists took over mainland China, she went to Taiwan, remained a legislator, but taught Western drama and wrote vernacular play called Baihua Ju, and started the Little Theater movement in Taiwan. Today, the cause and impact of the May 4th movement, your interpretation of it depends on who you talk to. And you can even say it's the legacy of the May 4th movement is June 4th, 1989 at TianAnMen Square. 多谢. Many thanks for your attention. And I'm going to stop share.
Okay.
Esther, any questions?
Let me see. So we don't have any question. I think everybody was really paying attention to all the history that you're talking about, but there were a few comments that I still want to read to you.
Yes. Okay.
So they say, always interesting to me that many of the Tong Association use the Masons logo with their initials.
Yes, only two, only the Bingong Tong and the Qigong Tong used this. The Bingong Tong was the first group to split from the Qigong Tong, and they had quite a conflict. So both claimed this to be Freemason. The other Tongs don't use it. In fact, they use the Freemason logo.
Okay. There are a few questions now. Why was it called the Boxer Rebellion? Like, why Boxer?
Well, they called them this group of people who rebel called themselves the Yihe Quan, the harmonious fist. So they claimed they were immune to bullets and that they could wipe out the Westerners. And because of this fist logo, or they call themselves the Yihe, so the Westerners called them boxers. And that's how the word came about.
I see. Okay. How does Taiwan and mainland differ in their idea on May 4th movement?
Okay.
Would you?
It's very, very complicated. As you can see from my talk, there's so many movements and so much in history, and every point of the way could be interpreted differently. Every one of these characters that I mentioned, some people think they are bad, other people think they're heroes. So today in mainland China, under communism, Mao Zedong said it really wasn't that much of a movement. The intellectuals were involved, but they didn't get the masses involved. They didn't get the peasants involved. It was good, but it wasn't a real movement. It wasn't a peasant. It was more of an intellectual movement, this May 4th movement. And from Chiang Kai-shek's point of view, he says, yeah, you can have reform, but you don't throw out the classics. He was one who was a Confucianist, and he really believed in Confucius teaching. In fact, under the Confucius system, you really honor your teacher. So in the city of Taipei, he put up a statue in one of these roundabouts in the center of Taipei, a statue of his teacher. Who else do you know? Any emperor, king, president around the world put up a statue of their teacher in the middle of the city to honor their teacher. So Chiang Kai-shek was a orthodox scholar. He said some of the reforms were good, but he said we threw out the baby with the water. So that's why in Taiwan is a day to honor literature, is Literature Day, whereas China is Youth Day. Neither side really see the importance, that much importance in it. So they said, well, in China, the youth stood up. And I'm not sure how they feel about June 4th. But so the interpretation can be any way, and I encourage everybody to go back and read this and come up with your own interpretation. But definitely with the May 4th movement, China was changed forever, and Chinese Americans were changed forever.
So is May 4th celebrated anywhere?
Yes, China as Youth Day and Taiwan as Literature Day. But here in America, maybe we as Chinese American can have another interpretation and cause something else. Because it really changed perception of Chinese Americans, that Chinese Americans would stand up and reform. And so that was a branding that the Chinese American in America wanted. Because the Chinese were, one of the reasons for the Chinese Exclusion Act was that the Americans believed Chinese always had a monarch, always had an emperor. So the Chinese here in America will be under the control of the emperor, like Catholics to the Pope, and that the Chinese will never understand democracy until 1911. The 100,000 Chinese in America at that time turned China, a country of 400 million, into a democratic republic. how can you then say these Chinese in America do not understand democracy, do not understand the Constitution, do not understand elections, when the 100,000 Chinese here made China a democratic republic?
Right.
Next question.
Yes. How did the Qigongtang help new immigrants from China, if at all?
Well, they got involved with many things. As there were 373 branches, they were oftentimes the only kind of city hall in all these small towns where Chinese were congregated. They made sure the laundries were kept separated, that you didn't open up on the same block and have competition. They would make sure that there weren't this competition and that these laundries would be open at further apart. And if you didn't, they took care of business. They made sure you moved. And they settled disputes. And it was only a problem if there were more than one Tong in a town. But they did a lot of these. They acted as the local sheriff and the local government, because there weren't such a thing, because they weren't just clan, not last name or from the same district. They were from all over. So they played that role. And in fact, they were more powerful than the Sixth Company starting in the 1880, 1890s up until maybe the 1930s.
We're going to talk about that on May 11th, right?
Okay, yes.
So don't tell them too much. Okay, two more questions. Can we get a book listed that, David, you use for your research, or actually you use more than one books on your research?
Oh, I use a lot. I
Yeah.
can. I'll list them and I'll give it to you, and maybe you can put it online when this becomes available on YouTube.
Okay.
You can put it on the Chinese American Heritage Foundation site or something. Yeah, I'll quote some of these. Yeah, sorry, I plagiarized a lot of things and not gave them credit, and even the pictures that I used. So shame on me.
It's okay. You can add it at the end of your PowerPoint later. One last question, because it's almost 9 o'clock. Do you think Cantonese language will continue or be lost by government action?
I think it'll continue. There's so many. Definitely Pacific Rim is really the Cantonese Rim. If you look at all the countries around the Pacific Rim, what's in common is Cantonese. And it is recognized by the UN as a separate language from Mandarin. Although there's the whole movement to make all the Chinese speak Mandarin, to have a national language, I think the Cantonese are pretty stubborn and tough people and quite conservative in many ways, and will keep this language. And definitely for the Tong poems, it recites better. And as long as there's Cantonese around the Pacific Rim, I think it will remain to a important language. In fact, if you go to the classics, the Chinese classics, you can't understand many of the words without understanding Cantonese. In the classics, they use words like zhen for a jug or a bottle. Today in Mandarin, it'll be ping. And, and we say han lo instead of zhou lu. So if you see the word hang in the classics, that's Cantonese. So much of the classics are in fact Cantonese, and it's in there that to learn the classics, it'll be good to learn Cantonese.
Great. Well, I really want to thank David for all the research you have done for us for this May 4th, 1919 movement. And we have get permission from David, and we'll be able, I have recorded it. So maybe I'll wait till David give me the credit of what he has done, and then I will add that, you know, to the YouTube that we're going to be uploading, so it'll be more appropriate. So please give us a little bit time of doing that. And as David mentioned, he has 2 more talks in this month of May. One is on May 11th about the Tongs. So if just now people are asking about it, so I'm sure he has a lot more to talk about Tongs. And May 19th, he's also going to talk with one of his friends about the Chinese opera. So I hope that you guys can go to our website, chf.us, and will be registered, and you can hear more from David. So thank you for all the attendees, and thank you, David, for your time again. That's a history that we should always learn and know about. So thank you very much. So everybody has a good night.